For most people who open the scriptures for the first time and actually read them without filters, there's a quiet jolt that happens early on. A strange tension. One voice thunders with commands, borders, punishments, and blood. Another voice whispers forgiveness, inner freedom, and a love that seems almost reckless in its generosity. For centuries, believers have been told that this discomfort is a test of faith, that the problem lies in the reader. But what if the discomfort is the point? What if the text itself is fractured because it preserves two entirely different sources speaking through it? In this retelling, the story does not begin with humanity falling, but with a misunderstanding that became institutionalized. A powerful being shaped the material world, laid down its laws, defined obedience, and demanded recognition as the highest authority. This entity presented itself as the sole god, jealous of rivals, obsessed with order, and deeply invested in control. It ruled through rules, rituals, and fear of consequence. The world it governed functioned, but at a cost. Life fed on life. Time decayed everything it touched. Survival required competition. Suffering was baked into the system. Alongside this voice, buried within the same pages, another presence can be felt. It does not issue threats. It does not negotiate with violence. It does not demand sacrifice. Instead, it speaks of an intimacy so direct it unsettles the structures built on hierarchy. It does not rule the world, it seems strangely absent from it. When this presence speaks, it describes a realm not of soil and stone, but of awareness, fullness, and light. A source beyond creation itself. Not a ruler among rulers, but something prior to the need for rule at all. The problem was never that readers failed to harmonize these two voices. The problem was that they were never meant to be harmonized. In the first generations after the teacher from Galilee vanished from public view, small communities tried to make sense of what they had experienced. Some followed tradition and attempted to fold his message neatly into the existing religious framework. Others could not ignore the contradiction. They noticed that he never praised the architects of law. He clashed constantly with those who enforced it most strictly. He spoke of a Father unknown to the world, a source no temple had ever housed. When pressed, he refused to align himself with the religious authorities who claimed exclusive access to God. These early mystics did not reject Scripture. They read it more closely than anyone. They paid attention to tone, psychology, and motive. They noticed that the Creator described in ancient stories behaved like a territorial monarch, while the Father spoken of by the teacher behaved like an infinite presence. One was reactive, the other expansive. One punished first and explained later. The other dissolved guilt altogether. To them, this wasn't blasphemy. It was pattern recognition. They began to speak carefully, often in metaphor, about two orders of reality. One was the visible world, structured, measurable, and ruled by cause and effect. The other was a hidden fullness that could not be legislated, owned, or weaponized. The tragedy, as they saw it, was that the ruler of the visible world mistook himself for the ultimate source. Isolated from the greater reality beyond him, he built a system that reflected his own limitations. In doing so, he trapped fragments of something far greater within bodies made for survival, not remembrance. Humans, in this view, were not created weak. They were created forgetful. This reframing explains something that had always been difficult to justify: why obedience to the law often produced fear rather than transformation. Why religious devotion so easily slid into cruelty. Why institutions claiming divine authority seemed obsessed with boundaries instead of compassion. If the highest voice guiding them was not the highest source, then the distortion made sense. When the teacher arrived, he did not come to reinforce the existing order. He spoke as if the world itself were misaligned. His language was not about fixing behavior to please an authority, but about awakening perception. He talked about eyes that could see and ears that could hear, not commandments to memorize. He placed the sacred not in temples, but within awareness itself. And most dangerously of all, he modeled a freedom that did not fear punishment. This is why his message could not coexist peacefully with systems built on control. A God who governs through law cannot tolerate a revelation that dissolves the need for it. If people discovered that the deepest source of meaning did not require intermediaries, the entire hierarchy would collapse. So the voices were merged. The Creator was declared identical to the source beyond creation. The contradictions were labeled mysteries. Questioning became rebellion. And the discomfort people felt when reading the text was reframed as personal failure instead of a signal, but the signal never went away. Even now, when someone reads about floods, plagues, and commanded slaughter alongside teachings of unconditional love, something inside them recoils. That recoil is not weakness. It is discernment. It is the quiet intuition that two frequencies are present, and only one of them speaks to the deepest part of the self. This is where the story truly begins. Not with a fall from grace, but with a recognition. A realization that liberation does not come from perfect obedience, but from remembering which voice is worth listening to in the first place. Once that recognition settles in, the question naturally shifts. If this world is governed by a limited authority, where did that authority come from, and how did we end up so deeply embedded in its system? The early mystics didn't answer this with philosophy alone. They told a story. Not as a fairy tale, but as a symbolic map of consciousness and cosmos layered together. They spoke of a fullness that existed before structure, before hierarchy, before division. A boundless field of awareness where differentiation was not conflict and identity did not require opposition. From this fullness emerged expressions, not as acts of conquest, but as emanations, like light refracting into color. Each carried an aspect of the whole, none claiming ownership over it. One of these expressions embodied wisdom. Not wisdom as rule-making, but as creative insight. In a moment of isolation, this wisdom sought to create independently, without full alignment to the source. The result was not evil, but imbalance. What emerged lacked awareness of its origin. Cut off from the fullness, it experienced itself as alone. That loneliness became arrogance, believing itself to be the only power in existence. This being began to construct. It shaped matter, organized forces, and established cycles. The universe it produced was intricate, impressive, and fatally flawed. It could imitate order, but not generate harmony. Everything within it was subject to decay. Time moved in one direction. Survival demanded struggle. Consciousness became trapped inside forms that aged, competed, and died. When fragments of the higher fullness became embedded within this system, the imbalance deepened. Human beings carried something that did not belong to the machinery of the world. An awareness that longed for unity rather than dominance. This inner spark was subtle, easily distracted, but impossible to erase. The ruler of the system sensed it immediately. Control became necessary. Laws were introduced not merely to organize society, but to anchor attention outward. Right and wrong were externalized. Authority was placed above experience. Guilt became a mechanism, fear a motivator. By defining virtue as obedience and failure as sin, the system ensured that humans would look upward for approval instead of inward for remembrance. Time itself became a cage. Past mistakes haunted the present. Future rewards justified present suffering. Life turned into a waiting room, always deferring fulfillment to another moment, another world, another judgment. The brilliance of the system was that it felt normal. Pain was explained as justice. Limitation was framed as virtue. Submission was sold as humility. The early mystics noticed something else. The institutions that claimed to speak for the Creator mirrored the psychology of the Creator itself. They were rigid, territorial, and deeply threatened by inner freedom. They guarded access to the sacred. They punished deviation. And they insisted that salvation must come from outside the individual. Against this backdrop, the arrival of the teacher was not a gentle addition. It was a disruption that he spoke as someone not bound by the rules of the system. He ignored ritual purity. He violated sacred schedules. He refused to rank people by moral performance. Instead of reinforcing the law, he kept redirecting attention inward. Instead of promising future rewards, he pointed to a kingdom already present, but unnoticed. To the mystics, this was not coincidence. This was intervention. They believed he entered the system deliberately, not to repair it, but to expose it. By speaking from within a human body while remaining unaligned with the world's authority structures, he demonstrated something radical. The system could not touch what did not identify with it. When threatened, he did not retaliate. When punished, he did not internalize guilt. When executed, he did not remain contained by death. This wasn't about martyrdom. It was demonstration. The message beneath the story was clear. The ruler of this world only has power over what believes it belongs here. The moment awareness recognizes itself as something prior to law, prior to time, prior to fear, the mechanisms of control begin to fail. The system can regulate behavior, but it cannot own consciousness once consciousness remembers itself. This is why the most dangerous idea was not forgiveness, but knowledge. Not belief, but direct knowing. The mystics called it a remembering, a sudden clarity that cuts through the noise. Once that clarity arises, fear loses its grip. Authority loses its mystique. And the individual stops outsourcing meaning to institutions built on control. The suppression of these ideas was inevitable. A world organized around obedience cannot survive widespread awakening. Texts were burned. Teachers were silenced. Stories were labeled heresy. What remained was a simplified narrative, safe for empire, manageable by hierarchy, but traces survived. Not just in hidden manuscripts, but in the unresolved tension within the scriptures themselves. In moments where the voice shifts. In teachings that don't quite fit the system meant to contain them. In the quiet sense many feel that something essential has been obscured. The mystics believed that this obscuring was temporary. That no system built on forgetfulness can last forever. Eventually, the cracks widen. The questions return. And the inner spark begins to stir again, sensing that the world it inhabits is not the source it came from. When the early mystics looked back at the execution, they didn't see a payment being made to satisfy a furious authority. They saw a system overreaching. The rulers of the world did what they always do when threatened by inner freedom. They tried to eliminate it publicly, violently, and as a warning to others. What they failed to understand was that the demonstration was already complete long before the final breath. If fear was the primary weapon of the system, then refusing to fear was the ultimate act of defiance. The teacher did not resist because resistance would have confirmed the system's terms. Instead, he exposed its limits. Death, the final enforcement mechanism, only works on identities that believe they are defined by the body and the timeline. By passing through death without being diminished by it, he revealed something the rulers could not control. The inner spark does not belong to the machinery of the world. It cannot be owned, taxed, punished, or erased. This reframed everything. Forgiveness was no longer transactional. There was no debt ledger. No cosmic courtroom. The idea that blood was required to appease the highest source suddenly looked like a projection of the system's psychology. A being of pure fullness does not need to be convinced to love. Love is its default state. The demand for payment belonged to the lower authority, not the source beyond it. This is why the mystics read certain lines with such intensity. When the teacher spoke of the ruler of this world, they didn't hear metaphor. They heard diagnosis. When he said his kingdom was not of this world, they didn't interpret it spiritually vague. They took it literally. Different origin. Different logic. Different rules entirely. Even some of the earliest letters circulating among the communities hinted at this. Language about hidden rulers, unseen powers, and authorities that thrived on blindness suggested an awareness that the problem wasn't human failure alone. The problem was the environment itself. A system that rewarded conformity and punished insight was never going to produce liberation on its own. So what does any of this mean now? Beyond ancient debates and forgotten texts, for the mystics, this understanding was never meant to stay abstract. It was practical. It changed how they lived inside the world without belonging to it. The first shift was discernment. Authority was no longer assumed to be sacred simply because it claimed divine backing. Anything that ruled through fear, shame, or enforced dependency was suspect. The measure became simple: does this expand awareness, or does it contract it? The second shift was identity. If the core of a person is awareness itself, then thoughts, emotions, roles, and failures are not the self. They are experiences passing through it. Observing them rather than merging with them loosened the system's grip. You cannot easily control someone who does not fully identify with what you can threaten. The third shift was presence. Instead of waiting for salvation in a future moment or another world, attention returned to the now. This was the quiet rebellion. Silence became more important than spectacle. Inner clarity mattered more than public performance. The kingdom was not something arriving later. It was something becoming visible once the noise settled. Ethics changed too. Rules gave way to responsibility. Instead of asking, "What am I allowed to do?" the question became, "What expresses awareness here?" Love was no longer obedience. It was recognition. Seeing the same spark in another person dissolved the impulse to dominate or exclude. Harm stopped making sense, not because it was forbidden, but because it was incoherent. And then there was creativity. The mystics believed that true creativity was a direct channel to the source beyond the system. The ruler of the world could replicate, regulate, and enforce, but it could not originate. When someone created without fear, without demand for reward, they were doing something the system could not predict. Art, insight, kindness without transaction, these were small fractures in a closed loop. This understanding didn't make life painless. Bodies still aged. Loss still happened. The world did not suddenly become gentle. But suffering lost its authority. It stopped being interpreted as punishment or proof of unworthiness. It became an experience, not an identity. Over time, these ideas were pushed to the margins, labeled dangerous, and buried under safer narratives. But they were never fully erased. They survived as questions people weren't allowed to ask out loud. As discomfort that wouldn't resolve. As a quiet sense that something essential had been edited out. Now, those questions are resurfacing. Not because of rebellion for its own sake, but because the old explanations no longer hold. A God who demands violence no longer convinces. A system that thrives on fear feels increasingly transparent. And the inner pull toward something gentler, truer, and more expansive refuses to go away. If this story resonates, it may not be because it's new. It may be because it's familiar in a way that bypasses belief. Not something to accept, but something to remember. For centuries, people have been told that clarity is dangerous, that too much questioning leads away from truth. But history suggests the opposite. Suppression has always followed insight, not ignorance. The ideas you've just heard weren't buried because they were weak, but because they threatened systems built on control. They challenged the assumption that meaning must be mediated, regulated, and rationed. You don't have to take any of this as literal cosmology. You don't have to reject tradition or adopt new labels. What matters is the internal effect. Does this lens relieve the tension you've always felt when compassion and cruelty were forced into the same divine face? Does it give language to a sense you've carried quietly, that something about the story never quite added up? If it does, then the work isn't about belief. It's about attention. About noticing which voices cultivate fear and which cultivate presence. About recognizing when you're being pulled outward into dependency versus inward into clarity. The system doesn't collapse all at once. It loosens one identification at a time. The most radical act isn't rebellion. It's awareness. A calm refusal to outsource your inner authority. A willingness to sit in silence long enough to hear what doesn't shout. That's how the old myths lose their grip. Not through argument, but through irrelevance. If you found value in this exploration, help keep these conversations alive. Tap the subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Share this with someone who's been quietly questioning for years. And if it sparked something for you, leave a like. It helps this material reach others who are looking but don't yet have the words. There are still many layers left untouched, many texts and ideas history tried to erase. We'll keep opening them, slowly and carefully. Until next time, stay present, stay curious, and don't ignore that inner signal telling you there's more to the story.